Step with me onto a beach in Kent. The year is 55 BC. You are a Roman legionary, and you are standing in a warship that will not move any closer to shore. The water beneath the hull is too shallow. Somewhere ahead of you on the sand, an army is waiting, thousands of Britons, chariots drawn up in ranks, horsemen circling, and behind them, more warriors than you were told to expect. Between you and them is water. Not deep water, waist deep, chest deep in places, but water full of enemies who are already wading out to meet you, throwing javelins, screaming in a language you do not understand. Your commander has given the order to land, and no one is moving. You are heavily armored. You do not know this coastline. You do not know how deep the water gets, or where the sandbars are, or whether the next step takes you under. Every man in that boat is doing the same terrible arithmetic, and every man is arriving at the same answer, not yet. Let someone else go first. And then, further down the line of ships, a man makes a decision that will be written down for 2,000 years. He is the standard bearer, the man who carries the eagle, the sacred emblem of the legion, the single object every soldier in that unit is sworn to protect with his life. He looks at the men freezing in the boats around him, and he jumps. Alone, in full armor, carrying the standard, he goes over the side into the surf and starts wading toward the enemy shore, shouting back at his own comrades that he at least will not be the man who let the eagle fall into British hands. It works. Shamed into motion, the legionaries pour off the ships behind him. This is how the Roman conquest of Britain begins. Not with a plan. With one terrified man making a choice so no one would call him a coward, and an invasion that, if you look closely at what actually happened next, was not really a conquest at all. When Julius Caesar returned to Rome after this campaign, the Senate did something it had never done before. It declared 20 days of public thanksgiving, an unprecedented honor, more than had ever been granted for any previous victory, to celebrate his achievements in Britain. Here is the problem. Caesar had not conquered Britain. He had barely set foot on it. He left with no territory, no garrison, no lasting foothold, and it would be another 97 years before Rome actually, truly took control of the island. So how does a campaign this thin produce a celebration this large? And why, if Caesar's invasion achieved so little, do we still tell the story as though he were the man who brought Britain into the Roman world? The answer says less about Britain than it does about Rome, about a man who needed a headline more than he needed a province, and who was very, very good at making sure the story that reached home was the story he wanted told. This is what actually happened when Julius Caesar came to Britain. And it is not the story of a conquest. It is the story of a nearly 2,000-year-old piece of political spin that we are still in some ways repeating. If you want the real history behind the legends men wrote about themselves, subscribe and walk with us. We read the propaganda so we can tell you what's underneath it. By 55 BC, Julius Caesar had spent several years fighting his way through Gaul, the region we now call France, in a long, brutal campaign of conquest that would eventually give him the reputation and the army he needed to change Roman history forever. His official reason for turning his attention across the Channel to Britain was tidy and defensible. British tribes, he claimed, had been sending aid to Gallic peoples resisting Rome. Punishing the source of that support was, on paper, simply good strategy, cutting off the enemy's rear before finishing the war in front of him. But look closer and the justification gets thinner. The clearest link was to the Veneti, a seafaring Gallic tribe with trading connections across the Channel, and the actual scale of British aid to the wider Gallic resistance appears, from what we can tell, to have been modest at best. What was not modest was Caesar's ambition. Back in Rome, he was one of three men, alongside Pompey and Crassus, locked in an increasingly dangerous competition for power, prestige, and the loyalty of the Roman public. Gaul had already given him plenty of victories. But Britain was different. Britain was, to the Roman imagination, the edge of the known world, a misty, half-mythical island beyond the ocean that even the god-descended heroes of old had never reached. Whatever Caesar found there, being the first Roman commander to cross that water and come home again, was, in itself, a kind of legend-making no victory in Gaul could match. There was talk of practical motives too, rumours of British silver, of pearls fished from British rivers. It came to very little. Cicero, hearing the reports afterward, remarked rather dryly that there wasn't a scrap of silver to be found on the whole island. So Caesar crossed the Channel in the late summer of 55 BC with roughly 2 legions, a modest force, more suited to a reconnaissance than a full invasion, and sailed toward a coastline no Roman commander had ever approached with an army. It went wrong almost immediately. The first problem revealed itself before the legions had even landed. The transport ships carrying Caesar's cavalry, desperately needed for scouting and for any real tactical flexibility once ashore, were delayed by winds and failed to make the crossing with the main force. Caesar would fight his opening engagement in Britain with infantry alone, blind on his flanks in country he had never seen. Then came the landing itself, the scene we opened with. Massed British forces, chariots and cavalry drawn up along the shore, and Roman soldiers frozen with fear in ships that could not get close enough to let them disembark in good order. It took the standard-bearer's desperate leap into the surf to break the stalemate and get the legions moving. Even after the landing succeeded, the campaign did not improve. Caesar's force, small and cautious, achieved a handful of inconclusive skirmishes against the British defenders, enough to claim engagement, not enough to claim victory. And then the weather intervened again, more decisively this time. A storm rolled in and battered the Roman fleet at anchor, wrecking ships, damaging others beyond repair, and cutting off any reliable route of resupply or reinforcement from Gaul. Caesar was now on a hostile, half-explored island with a battered fleet, a small army, dwindling supplies and no cavalry. He took some hostages from local tribes as a face-saving gesture toward the appearance of submission, and then he did the only sensible thing available to him. He left. The first invasion of Britain achieved, in real terms, almost nothing. No territory held. No lasting agreement enforced. No garrison. A commander who had arrived with an army and left with a story. And the story is what mattered. When word reached Rome, not the full, unvarnished account, but Caesar's own carefully composed version of events, written in the third person in his commentary to create the appearance of sober, impartial reporting, the Senate responded with that unprecedented 20-day Thanksgiving. Crossing the ocean to the edge of the world, in the Roman imagination, was itself the achievement, regardless of what had or hadn't been accomplished once he got there. Caesar had learned something valuable. The size of the celebration did not need to match the size of the victory. It needed to match the size of the story he told about it. He would need a better story for what came next. The following year, Caesar came back properly. This time there would be no half measures. He assembled a genuinely formidable force, by the account that survives something in the region of 800 ships, 5 full legions and 2,000 cavalry. This was not a reconnaissance. This was an invasion in every sense the first campaign had failed to be. Modern archaeological work, notably research from the University of Leicester, has helped confirm the likely landing site, a beach at Ebbsfleet in what is now Pegwell Bay in Kent, a location whose geography in Caesar's time matches his own description of the landing far more precisely than earlier guesses had assumed. This time, the Britons did not contest the landing directly, whether from the sheer scale of the force arriving or from tactical calculation. The beach was, remarkably, undefended when the Romans came ashore. Caesar pushed inland. Ranged against him now was a coalition of British tribes under the command of a warlord named Cassivellaunus, ruler of the powerful Catuvellauni, based north of the River Thames. After a series of engagements in which Cassivellaunus's forces could not match the Romans in open battle, the British commander made the same calculations smart defenders have made against superior invading armies throughout history. He stopped trying to win a decisive battle and switched to harassment, hit-and-run raids, chariot skirmishes, disrupting Roman foraging parties, refusing ever to commit his full strength to a fight he could not win outright. It slowed the Romans. It did not stop them. Caesar pushed his army across the Thames and advanced toward Cassivellaunus's own stronghold, likely near modern Weethampstead, a fortified position defended by dense woodland and earthworks. The Romans besieged it, broke the defense and forced the issue. Cassivellaunus, his position collapsing and rival British tribes beginning to defect to the Roman side rather than share his fate, sought terms. We're tracing exactly how far Rome's victory actually reached, and exactly where the story stopped matching the reality. If you want the deeper breakdowns and the maps behind campaigns like this one, the membership link is in the description. Now the terms Cassivellaunus actually accepted. The settlement Caesar reached with Cassivellaunus looked, on paper, like exactly the outcome a conquering general wanted. Cassivellaunus agreed to pay tribute to Rome. Hostages were exchanged, the traditional guarantee of good faith in these arrangements. and critically, Caesar installed a client ruler of his own choosing, a man named Mandubracius, of the Trinovantes tribe, a rival group who had suffered under Cassivellaunus and had appealed to Caesar for protection. Mandubracius was placed on his tribe's throne as, in effect, a Roman-backed king, owing his position and his loyalty to the man who had put him there. This is precisely the kind of arrangement Rome used successfully across the ancient world: install a friendly local ruler, extract tribute and loyalty, and let the client kingdom do the daily work of governing itself while ultimately answering to Rome. If it held, it would have been a genuine, if indirect, form of control. Caesar wrote to his friend Cicero back in Rome, summing up the results of the campaign in a single blunt line that survives to this day: hostages taken, but no plunder. And then, with autumn approaching and the Channel crossing becoming more dangerous by the week, and with fresh unrest already stirring back in Gaul demanding his attention, Caesar did something that tells you almost everything about how seriously Rome intended to actually hold what it had just won. He left. He took his legions, his cavalry, his hostages and his fleet and sailed back across the Channel, and left not a single Roman soldier behind. No garrison, no fort, no administrator. Nothing but a treaty, a client king, and a promise of tribute that no one was actually present to enforce. You do not need to guess what happens to a tribute agreement with no soldiers behind it. History tells us directly. Within a generation, the arrangement Caesar had constructed was already unraveling. The evidence survives, oddly enough, in coins. The currency struck by British rulers in the decades after Caesar's departure lets historians trace exactly who held power and when. By around 10 BC, a Catuvellaunian ruler named Cassivellaunus, from the very tribe Caesar had defeated, had conquered the Trinovantes outright, the very tribe Caesar had specifically protected and installed a client king to rule. The settlement Caesar negotiated at Spear Point had lasted, in real enforceable terms, perhaps a decade or two before the old power balance simply reasserted itself, Rome nowhere in sight to object. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing more than a century later with the clear benefit of hindsight, delivered perhaps the single most accurate verdict on the entire affair. Caesar, he wrote, had revealed, rather than bequeathed, Britain to Rome. He had shown Rome that the island existed, that it could be reached, that its people could be fought and briefly beaten. He had not given Rome the island itself. He had given Rome a map and a memory, nothing that could be taxed, governed, or defended. We made something for people who care about the difference between the headline and the actual result. The kind of history that survives the fact-check. If you want to carry a piece of that, the link is in the description. For nearly a century after Caesar sailed away, Rome did not return to Britain with an army. That does not mean nothing happened. Trade deepened across those decades. Roman goods, wine and luxury items flowing into Britain, British exports flowing the other way, diplomatic contacts building slowly between the Roman world and the tribes of southern Britain. The relationship Caesar's invasion had briefly and violently stayed open, in a much quieter form long after his legions had gone home. But actual conquest, soldiers, garrisons, a province with a governor and a tax roll, waited. It waited through the end of the Roman Republic. It waited through the reign of Augustus, who reportedly considered invading Britain himself more than once and chose, each time, not to bother. It waited through Tiberius and Caligula, the latter of whom apparently marched an army to the Channel coast, and then, for reasons the ancient sources treat with something between confusion and mockery, turned around and went home without crossing at all. It took in the end a very different kind of emperor to finish what Caesar had only begun. Not a battlefield genius chasing glory. A man history had mostly written off, sickly, stammering, considered by much of his own family to be an embarrassment, elevated to power almost by accident after the murder of his predecessor. That man was Claudius. And in AD 43, 97 years after Caesar's standard-bearer jumped into the surf at Kent, Claudius sent the army that Caesar never did, an army meant to stay. Here is what stays with you. We remember Julius Caesar as the man who brought Rome to Britain, and in the narrowest sense, that's true, he was the first. But being first and actually accomplishing something are not the same achievement, and the gap between them is exactly where this story lives. Caesar needed Britain to be a triumph more than he needed it to actually be conquered. He was competing for the attention and loyalty of Rome against two of the most powerful men alive, and a story about crossing the edge of the known world did more for that competition than a slow, unglamorous, well-administered province ever could have. So he wrote the story he needed, in his own words, in his own third-person voice, pretending at objectivity, and Rome believed it, celebrated it, and mostly forgot to ask what was actually left behind on that island once the ships sailed home. Nothing was left behind. No fort. No governor. No soldier. Just a fading treaty that the very people it was meant to bind quietly tore apart within a generation, and a story that outlived the reality by nearly 2,000 years. That is the pattern worth remembering, far beyond Britain and far beyond Caesar. The loudest telling of an event and the truest telling of it are very often not the same telling. The 20-day celebration in Rome had almost nothing to do with what actually happened on a beach in Kent. It had everything to do with what one ambitious man needed people back home to believe. 97 years later, a far less celebrated man did the quiet, difficult work of actually finishing the job, and history remembers him far less vividly than the one who merely arrived, looked around and left. The man who finally did conquer Britain was nothing like Caesar. He was overlooked, mocked by his own family, and never expected to rule at all. His name was Claudius, and in AD 43 he sent the army that made Britain Roman for the next 360 years. That story is next. Click it, and walk with us further